A single photograph from 1919 sits in a university archive. It shows a happy factory picnic. Workers and their families smile at the camera on a bright summer day. But when modern technology zoomed into this innocent image, historians found something that changed everything they knew about this small industrial town. What they discovered hiding in the background would reveal a century-old secret so horrifying that it rewrites the entire history of Havenwood. Dr. Alistair Finch spent his days in the quiet halls of Glenfield University's historical archive. His world was one of careful cataloging and forgotten history. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight as he worked through boxes of old documents and photographs. It was methodical work that suited his precise nature perfectly. When the university received the complete archives of the Blackwood Iron Works, Alistair was tasked with digitizing the massive collection. The factory had been the beating heart of Havenwood from the 1880s until it mysteriously shut down in the early 1920s. No one had ever examined these records before. Among hundreds of documents, invoices, and production reports, Alistair discovered a large-format group photograph. The faded label read, Blackwood Iron Works Annual Summer Picnic, July 1919. The image captured a perfect moment of early 20th century American optimism. Dozens of workers and their families had gathered in a sunny clearing surrounded by tall oak trees. Children played between the adults, their faces bright with laughter. Women, in long white dresses, held delicate parasols to shield themselves from the sun. Men, in their best Sunday clothes, stood proudly next to their wives and children. At the center of it all stood Silas Blackwood himself, the factory owner, his chest puffed out with obvious pride and satisfaction. To preserve every detail for future researchers, Alistair ran the photograph through a high-resolution scanner. As he examined the digital file on his computer monitor, he began zooming in to appreciate the individual faces and period clothing. The detail was remarkable. He could see the intricate patterns on the women's dresses and the careful way the men had combed their hair for the special occasion. His cursor drifted to the background of the image, near the dark tree line that bordered the picnic area. That's when he noticed something that didn't belong. Partially hidden behind a large oak tree stood a shape that made him pause. It was far too tall and thin to be a person. The proportions were all wrong, unnaturally stretched and distorted in ways that hurt to look at. The figure wore what appeared to be dark, tattered clothing that seemed to move even in the still photograph. But where a face should be, there was only impenetrable shadow. It stood perfectly motionless, watching the happy scene unfold with an attention that felt predatory. Alistair rubbed his tired eyes and looked again. The shape was still there, a dark presence at the very edge of joy and celebration. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a photographic error or processing mistake. Old film could play strange tricks, especially when exposed to heat and humidity over many decades. Shadows could create optical illusions that fooled the eye. But something about this particular figure bothered him deeply. He couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that it was deliberately positioned there, carefully observing the festivities like a hunter studying prey. The more he stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. Determined to solve the mystery, he ran multiple diagnostic checks on his scanning equipment. Every test came back normal. The machinery was working perfectly with no signs of malfunction or error. He carefully examined the original photograph negative under a powerful magnifying glass. It was in pristine condition with no signs of damage, scratches, or chemical manipulation. Whatever was in that photograph had been there from the moment the shutter clicked in 1919. Troubled by what he'd found, Alistair sent the isolated section of the image to Dr. Sarah Chen in the university's forensic imaging department. She was an expert in photographic analysis and had helped solve several historical mysteries through careful examination of old images. When she called him back 2 days later, her voice was unusually quiet and uncertain. The figure was definitely real, she explained carefully, not a photographic anomaly or processing error of any kind. But there was something else, something that made no scientific sense according to everything she knew about photography and light. The illumination in the photograph seemed to bend around the figure in ways that defied the basic laws of physics. Based on the position of the sun and the shadows cast by trees and people, natural light should have fallen on the figure from a specific angle. Instead, this shape seemed to create its own zone of absolute darkness. It absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating impossible shadows where there should be bright sunlight. Unable to focus on his other archival work, Alistair shifted his complete attention to researching the history of Blackwood Iron Works itself. What he discovered in the factory records made his stomach turn with growing unease. The year 1919, despite being officially recorded as one of the factory's most profitable and successful years, also had an unusually high number of fatal workplace accidents. The death rate was nearly 3 times the national average for similar heavy industries. Official incident reports listed the deaths as tragic but explainable workplace incidents. Several workers had apparently fallen into vats of molten iron during their shifts. Others had been caught in machinery malfunctions that crushed or mangled their bodies beyond recognition. Some had died in sudden furnace explosions that investigators could never adequately explain. Each report was filled out in careful detail, signed by supervisors and filed away without question. As Alistair dug deeper into Silas Blackwood's private factory ledgers and personal business records, he found entries that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Among the standard production numbers, cost calculations, and shipping manifests were strange, repeated notations written in different colored ink. These entries appeared to be added after the official records were completed. After every reported fatal accident, there was a corresponding entry written in the margins of the ledger books. One entry read, "Furnace was fed according to schedule. Production quota exceeded expectations." Another stated, "The shadow is placated for now. Full output restored to normal levels." The language was cryptic and deeply unsettling, suggesting that these tragic accidents might not have been random workplace incidents at all. The phrasing implied a deliberate pattern, as if the deaths were planned events rather than unfortunate mistakes. The more Alistair studied the photograph with fresh eyes, the more disturbing details began to emerge from the seemingly innocent scene. He carefully cross-referenced the names of workers who had died in factory accidents during 1919 with the faces visible in the picnic image. The discovery that followed made his hands shake uncontrollably. At least 5 of the men who would die in supposed accidents in the weeks immediately following the summer picnic were clearly visible in the photograph, alive and happy. There was Thomas Hayes, grinning broadly as he held his young son high on his shoulders. The little boy was laughing with pure delight. Next to them stood Marcus Webb, who according to official records would fall into a furnace and die just 2 weeks after this photograph was taken. These men were laughing and enjoying themselves with their families, completely unaware that they had somehow already been marked for death by forces they couldn't understand. In a dusty cardboard box filled with miscellaneous employee belongings that had never been claimed, Alistair found something that would change his understanding of everything. It was a small leather-bound journal belonging to Thomas Hayes, the same cheerful man he had identified holding his son in the photograph. The journal's early entries were filled with hope and genuine optimism about his job at the factory and his future in Havenwood. Thomas wrote enthusiastically about providing for his growing family and building a stable life in what seemed like a prosperous community. He described his fellow workers as good men who took care of each other. He praised Silas Blackwood as a fair employer who paid better wages than most factory owners. But as Alistair read through the chronological pages, Thomas's tone shifted dramatically from hope to fear. The worker began describing a constant, oppressive feeling of being watched, especially during the dangerous night shifts when fewer people were around to witness what happened in the darker corners of the factory. He wrote about conversations among the older, more experienced workers that would stop abruptly whenever supervisors or foremen approached. There were whispered stories about things that shouldn't exist, things that lived in the deep places beneath the factory floor. Thomas mentioned a figure that some workers claimed to see near the great furnace during the late hours. They called it the man made of shadow, and described how it would appear and disappear without making any sound. Most of the workers refused to talk about it directly, but Thomas noticed how they would avoid certain areas of the factory after dark. They would take longer routes to avoid walking past specific machines or corridors. Most troubling of all was Thomas's final entry, dated just 3 days after the cheerful summer picnic captured in the photograph. His handwriting was shaky and rushed, as if he had been frightened while writing. "Mr. Blackwood looked at me today during the morning shift meeting," he wrote. "The way he stared at me was not normal. It was like I was livestock being examined and sized up for slaughter. I saw the shadow figure again last night, closer than it has ever been before. It stood right at the very edge of the furnace light, just watching me work. I could feel its attention like ice water in my veins. I have a terrible feeling that I am not going to make it out of Havenwood alive." There were no more entries after that ominous prediction. According to factory records, Thomas Hayes died in a furnace explosion exactly 1 week later. The final piece of this horrifying puzzle came from a completely unexpected source. While carefully examining a large wooden shipping crate that had belonged to Silas Blackwood's personal office, Alistair discovered a hidden compartment built into the bottom. The secret space had been cleverly concealed and would have been impossible to find without removing the crate's contents completely. Inside this hidden compartment was Silas Blackwood's private journal, bound in expensive leather and filled with elegant, educated handwriting. What Alistair read in those yellowed pages made him question everything he thought he understood about reality itself. Blackwood wrote in great detail about the early days of his struggling factory, when it was barely managing to compete with larger, more established operations in nearby cities. He described months of sleepless nights spent worrying about bankruptcy, failure, and the collapse of everything he had worked to build. Then came the discovery that would change his fate forever. While his workers were digging the foundation for a new, larger furnace, they had accidentally broken through into an extensive natural cave system that existed deep beneath the factory floor. In those ancient caves, Blackwood claimed to have found something that had been sleeping in the earth for countless centuries, something old and hungry and terrible. The entity, which Blackwood respectfully called the furnace shadow, was drawn to intense industrial heat like a moth to flame. It thrived on the combination of fire and human life force. Blackwood wrote that the creature had communicated with him, not through spoken words but by placing thoughts and images directly into his mind. The experience had been overwhelming and transformative. The ancient being offered him a bargain that seemed too good to refuse. In exchange for occasional offerings of human life, carefully selected and presented at the right times, the entity would ensure his factory's success beyond anything he could imagine. The shadow would prevent real mechanical accidents that might shut down production. It would guide his business decisions and guarantee unprecedented productivity and profit margins. What Blackwood described next made Alistair feel physically sick. The factory accidents weren't random workplace incidents at all. They were carefully planned ritual sacrifices, designed to feed the hungry shadow that lived beneath the foundry. Blackwood would personally select workers based on criteria that only he fully understood. Sometimes he chose men with no families who wouldn't be missed by the community. Other times he selected workers who asked too many questions or seemed likely to cause labor problems. The shadow didn't care about his reasons for choosing specific victims. It only cared about being fed regularly and on schedule. The 1919 summer picnic, according to Blackwood's detailed journal entries, held a very special significance in this arrangement. The shadow rarely emerged from the deep places beneath the factory, preferring to remain close to the intense heat of the industrial furnaces. But the large gathering of potential victims had somehow drawn it to the surface on that bright summer day. Blackwood saw this rare appearance as a perfect opportunity and deliberately arranged for the group photograph to be taken at that exact moment. He wanted a permanent record of the occasion, a private trophy that would show his human flock alongside their hidden supernatural shepherd. The dark figure standing at the edge of the trees wasn't a photographic error or a trick of light and shadow. It was the entity itself, captured on film as it carefully surveyed the men, women, and children who had gathered to celebrate their community. It was choosing its next meals. Alistair sat back in his office chair, completely overwhelmed by the weight of what he had discovered. He looked again at the high-resolution image glowing on his computer monitor, focusing on the impossibly dark figure standing motionless among the oak trees. As he stared at the screen, the fluorescent lights in his office began to flicker in an irregular pattern. The temperature in the small room seemed to drop several degrees in just a few seconds. For one absolutely terrifying moment, he could swear he saw the shadow in the century-old photograph move ever so slightly. Its faceless head appeared to turn toward the camera, toward him, as if it had somehow become aware that someone in the present day was studying its image. The feeling of being watched by something ancient and malevolent was overwhelming. He quickly saved all of his research files and shut down his computer, but the oppressive feeling of invisible eyes didn't leave him. As he gathered his papers and notebooks and prepared to leave the archive building, Alistair realized with growing dread that by uncovering this century-old secret, he might have drawn the attention of something that was never supposed to be disturbed or awakened. The shadow had been sleeping beneath an abandoned factory for nearly 100 years, but now someone knew the truth about what it was and what it had done. This single photograph from a sunny summer day in 1919 had exposed a conspiracy of ritual human sacrifice that had been hidden beneath the town's prosperity and success for generations. It makes you wonder what other unspeakable horrors might be lurking in the backgrounds of old family pictures, preserved forever in silver and chemicals, waiting patiently for the wrong person to look just a little too closely. The past isn't always as innocent as it appears in faded photographs. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight, captured forever in the corner of what should have been a happy memory. What do you think about this chilling discovery? Have you ever noticed something strange in an old photograph that you couldn't explain? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that will make you question everything you think you know about history.